March 7th, 1945. The Rhine River, Remagen, Germany. The sound arrives first. A deep mechanical rumble that cuts through the crack of rifle fire and the distant thunder of artillery. Then the sight. Enormous steel sections rolling forward on tracked vehicles, each piece weighing tons, moving with impossible speed toward the river's edge. German soldiers in hastily constructed positions along the eastern bank watch through the smoke and dust, their hands frozen on their weapons, unable to process what they are witnessing. The Americans are building a bridge, not in the safety of their rear positions, not under cover of night, but here, now, in broad daylight, with German mortars falling around them and machine gun fire tearing through the air. Engineers in olive drab uniforms work with mechanical precision, their movements practiced and efficient despite the chaos. Steel meets steel with resounding clanks that echo across the water. The bridge grows like a living thing, extending from the western bank, reaching toward Germany proper, toward the heart of the Reich. And the German soldiers, young men who have been taught that their enemies are soft and decadent, that American industry produces quantity without quality, that Germanic discipline will always triumph over democratic disorder, can only stare in disbelief. They are watching something their training never prepared them for, the industrialization of warfare at a scale that makes individual courage irrelevant, that transforms the ancient art of combat into an exercise in logistics and manufacturing capacity. The bridge continues to grow. The Americans continue to work. And the world these German soldiers thought they understood begins to crack, like ice under spring sun. To comprehend the shock of this moment, one must first understand what German military doctrine had promised. The Wehrmacht, that supposedly invincible war machine, had built its reputation on speed and audacity. Blitzkrieg, lightning war, the rapid penetration of enemy lines using combined arms tactics, had conquered Poland in weeks, France in months. German engineering was renowned throughout the world. Their tanks, their aircraft, their industrial precision, all of it had been elevated to mythological status by years of propaganda. German soldiers were taught that they represented the pinnacle of military evolution, that their discipline and tactical sophistication would overcome any material disadvantage. They had been told that the Americans, when they finally arrived in force, would be poorly trained, inadequately equipped, reliant on brute numbers rather than skill. They had been assured that American industry, for all its vaunted production capacity, created weapons of inferior quality, that American soldiers lacked the ideological commitment necessary for modern warfare, that the mongrel democracy across the Atlantic could never match the focused power of the National Socialist state. The Rhine River had stood as Germany's natural defensive barrier for 2,000 years. Roman legions had struggled to cross it. Medieval armies had been stopped by its current and width. In 1945, with the Wehrmacht in retreat, but still capable of fierce resistance, German commanders believed they could hold the Rhine indefinitely. Every bridge had been wired for demolition. Every crossing point had been fortified. The plan was simple. Destroy the bridges, force the Americans to attempt river crossings under fire, bleed them white in the process, buy time for the miracle weapons that Goebbels promised would turn the tide of war. But on March 7th, that plan began to unravel when American forces discovered the Ludendorff Bridge at Remagen still standing, its demolition charges having only partially detonated. Within hours, American troops were streaming across, establishing a bridgehead on the eastern bank, and then the bridges began to appear. The Bailey Bridge, invented by British civil engineer Donald Bailey in 1940, represented a revolution in military engineering. Each component was designed to be light enough, for 6 men to carry, yet strong enough when assembled to support tanks and heavy vehicles. The panels were interchangeable, prefabricated, mass-produced in factories thousands of miles from the front lines. American Army engineers had trained for months in the rapid deployment of these structures, practicing until the process became automatic, until they could work under the worst conditions imaginable. But German soldiers had never seen anything like this. In their experience, bridge building was a lengthy process, requiring specialized equipment, calm conditions, and time. The idea of constructing a bridge capable of bearing 30-ton tanks while under direct enemy fire seemed fantastical, impossible, something from a fevered imagination rather than military reality. Obergefreiter Hans Dietrich, a machine gunner from the 89th Infantry Division, would survive the war and give testimony to American interrogators about his experience at Remagen. His words, preserved in the National Archives, capture the psychological impact of that moment. We had been told to expect the Americans to be cautious, methodical, slow to exploit opportunities. Instead, we saw madness. They built bridges as if they were assembling toys, seemingly unconcerned with our fire. We hit them, we saw men fall, and others immediately took their place. The bridge kept growing. We realized then that we were not fighting an army. We were fighting a factory, and the factory was winning. The symbolic power of the portable bridge cannot be overstated. In a single image, it encapsulated everything that differentiated the American approach to warfare from the German. Where German doctrine emphasized the decisive battle, the breakthrough, the operational art of maneuver, American doctrine emphasized overwhelming material superiority and the systematic application of industrial power. Where Germany sought victory through tactical brilliance and ideological fervor, America sought victory through production capacity and logistical efficiency. The portable bridge represented the industrialization of every aspect of warfare, the reduction of complex military problems to matters of engineering and resource allocation. It said to the Germans, "Your courage means nothing. Your tactical skill means nothing. Your fighting spirit means nothing, because we can simply build our way to victory while you watch." By March 1945, Germany was a dying nation. Allied bombing had devastated industrial capacity. The eastern territories that had provided food and resources were lost to the Soviet advance. Fuel was so scarce that tanks sat immobilized for lack of gasoline. Ammunition was rationed. Food supplies were collapsing. The German army still fought with remarkable tenacity, but it was fighting without hope, motivated by fear of Soviet revenge and the lingering power of Nazi indoctrination. Soldiers in the West knew, even if they could not admit it openly, that the war was lost. But the speed of collapse, the utter inability to slow the American advance, this caught many by surprise. They had expected a long, grinding campaign, a repeat of the First World War's stalemate. Instead, they encountered a military machine that operated at a tempo they could not match, that built bridges faster than they could destroy them, that replaced losses faster than they could inflict them, that seemed to have infinite resources and infinite patience. The construction of a Bailey Bridge under fire typically proceeded in stages. First, reconnaissance teams would survey the crossing site, measuring distances and checking soil stability. Then engineer battalions would move forward with the bridge components loaded on specialized trucks. The sections would be unloaded and assembled on the near bank, then pushed across the gap using rollers and manpower, each panel locked into the next with pins and bolts. Cross braces provided stability. Decking was laid to create a roadway. The entire process, when executed by well-trained crews, could take as little as 3 hours for a bridge capable of carrying tanks. 3 hours from empty riverbank to functioning supply line. This was the arithmetic of American abundance, the practical application of industrial might to tactical problems. German attempts to stop these constructions were desperate and ultimately futile. Artillery fire would damage sections, forcing delays while replacements were brought forward. But American engineers had calculated losses into their planning. They brought extra panels, extra equipment, extra everything. If a truck was destroyed, another arrived within minutes. If a section was hit, another was immediately fitted. The bridge construction became a test of wills, German firepower against American logistics, and logistics won every time. Luftwaffe aircraft, the few that still functioned, attempted bombing runs against the bridges but were driven off by overwhelming anti-aircraft fire. The Americans had planned for this too, positioning batteries of quad-mounted 50-caliber machine guns around every construction site, creating curtains of lead that made low-level attacks suicidal. The psychological effect on German defenders was profound and cumulative. They had been retreating for months, giving ground across France and Belgium, falling back to prepared positions only to find them outflanked or overrun. Each stand made little difference. Each defensive line was pierced. And now, at the Rhine, what should have been their last great obstacle, they watched bridges multiply like mushrooms after rain. Portable bridges, pontoon bridges, repaired permanent bridges, railroad bridges converted for vehicle use. Every crossing point became a highway for American men and material. The bridgehead at Remagen expanded daily. Within a week, multiple divisions had crossed. Within 2 weeks, the bridgehead was 40 miles wide and 20 miles deep. The Rhine, the sacred German river, the natural moat that was supposed to buy precious time, had been rendered irrelevant by American engineering. Lieutenant Colonel David Peregrine, commanding officer of the 291st Engineer Combat Battalion, the unit that worked on the Remagen bridges, kept detailed records of the operation. His after-action reports, now housed in the Army Corps of Engineers archives, provide a detailed picture of the logistics involved. His battalion brought forward over 500 tons of bridge equipment in the first 72 hours. They worked in shifts around the clock. They sustained casualties, 23 men killed, and over 100 wounded during the bridge operations, but they never stopped working. When asked by a reporter after the war how his men maintained morale under such conditions, Peregrine responded, "We knew what we were doing mattered. Every hour we shaved off the construction time was an hour less for the Germans to organize resistance. Every bridge we built was a highway for victory." The men understood that. They were proud to be engineers. They knew they were winning the war with hammers and wrenches as much as their comrades were with rifles and tanks. This professional pride, this understanding of purpose, marked another contrast with the German military experience by 1945. German soldiers increasingly fought without strategic context, following orders because that was what soldiers did, but lacking any clear vision of what victory would look like or how it could be achieved. American soldiers, by contrast, could see the direct connection between their efforts and the war's outcome. They were building bridges that would lead to Berlin. They were constructing the physical infrastructure of victory. This gave meaning to the suffering and danger, provided psychological resilience that pure ideological indoctrination could never match. The portable bridge became a recurring feature of the American advance through Germany. At every river crossing, at every blown bridge site, American engineers appeared with their Bailey components and began construction. The German army developed tactics to counter this. Pre-registered artillery coordinates at likely crossing sites, dedicated rapid reaction forces to counterattack bridgeheads, underwater obstacles to complicate pontoon bridge placement. None of it made enough difference. The Americans adapted faster, deployed more resources, accepted casualties as the price of maintaining momentum. The war became a race, German forces trying to establish defensive positions versus American engineers trying to maintain supply lines across increasingly chaotic terrain. The engineers won. They always won. Because behind them stood the full industrial capacity of the United States, churning out bridge sections and replacement parts and everything else needed to sustain a modern army in the field. Consider the mathematics of this abundance. In 1944, American factories produced 96,000 aircraft, 17,000 tanks, 41 billion rounds of ammunition, and enough other equipment to supply not only American forces, but significant portions of British, Soviet, and other Allied armies. The Bailey Bridge components were a tiny fraction of this output, yet they were produced in such quantities that American engineers rarely worried about running short. They could afford to leave damaged sections behind, to prioritize speed over economy, to treat equipment as disposable if it meant maintaining operational tempo. German forces, fighting on ever-dwindling resources, could not comprehend this. They repaired and reused everything, cannibalizing damaged vehicles for parts, counting every bullet. The contrast was not just material, but philosophical. American abundance was built on a system that valued efficiency and standardization, that treated soldiers as valuable resources to be properly equipped, that understood that well-supplied troops fight more effectively than desperate ones. The soldiers building these bridges under fire were not supermen. They were farmers from Iowa, factory workers from Detroit, college students from California, a cross-section of American society given technical training and dropped into the most dangerous work imaginable. Many were draftees who had never expected to spend their war assembling bridges while German artillery tried to kill them. But they did the work because it needed doing, because their training had prepared them, because the officers and NCOs leading them were competent professionals who understood their craft. This was the strength of the American military system, not individual brilliance or ideological fervor, but systematic competence multiplied across millions of men. German military memoirs from the final months of the war repeatedly expressed disbelief at American material superiority. General Heinz Guderian, one of the architects of Blitzkrieg doctrine, wrote in his post-war memoir, "We had known the Americans were rich. We had not understood what that wealth meant in practical terms. They wasted more in a day than we produced in a month. They threw away equipment we would have treasured. They built bridges while we struggled to maintain roads. The war became unwinnable not because they were better soldiers, but because they were better supplied. In the end, logistics defeated strategy." This was the lesson the portable bridge taught, that modern warfare had become primarily an industrial and logistical challenge, that tactical brilliance could not overcome systemic material disadvantage, that the nation which could mobilize and sustain the largest industrial base would ultimately prevail. The Germans had entered the war believing that willpower and tactical sophistication would carry them to victory despite resource constraints. They learned, slowly and painfully, that this was a delusion. America's ability to project power came not from the fighting spirit of individual soldiers, though they fought courageously, but from the organizational capacity to keep those soldiers supplied, supported, and connected to the industrial base that sustained them. The bridges also represented something deeper, the American philosophy of problem-solving through engineering, where European military traditions emphasized glory and sacrifice. American culture emphasized practical solutions and technological innovation. The Bailey Bridge was not a weapon that killed enemies. It was a tool that enabled movement, that solved the problem of rivers and gaps and blown infrastructure. It represented a mindset that viewed war as a series of technical challenges to be systematically addressed. This mindset, applied across every aspect of military operations, created an army that was not necessarily more courageous or skilled than its opponents, but was certainly more effective at maintaining operations across time and space. As spring advanced into summer in 1945, as American forces drove deeper into Germany and the Reich collapsed into chaos, the portable bridges continued to multiply. They crossed not just the Rhine, but the Elbe, the Danube, the Oder, every river barrier that might have slowed the advance. German defenders, increasingly composed of old men and boys as the trained army was destroyed, could only watch as these structures appeared. Some tried to fight. Many surrendered. All understood that resistance was futile. The bridges were both physical infrastructure and psychological warfare, proof that German defeat was inevitable, that no natural barrier could save them, that American power was unstoppable. Corporal Friedrich Weber, captured near the Elbe in April 1945, told his interrogators, "We were told the Americans were cowards, that they would not fight without overwhelming advantage. But what we saw was not cowardice. It was something we had no word for. They did not need to be brave because they had made courage unnecessary. They built bridges while we shot at them, and they kept building until the bridge was finished, and then their tanks came across, and we had to retreat or die. There was no glory in it, no honor, just the grinding certainty that they had more of everything and would use it all to crush us. I stopped believing in victory when I saw my first Bailey Bridge. I knew then that we were fighting the future, and the future does not lose. This existential recognition that the portable bridge represented not just tactical capability, but historical inevitability, spread through the German ranks in the war's final months. It contributed to the collapse of fighting spirit, to the mass surrenders on the Western Front, to the preference for capture by Americans rather than Russians. German soldiers understood, perhaps better than their commanders, that the war was not just lost, but that it had been unwinnable from the start. The industrial disparity was too vast. The American ability to turn factories into weapons was something the Reich could never match. The bridges were evidence of this, impossible to deny or rationalize away. After the war, when historians began analyzing the campaign in Western Europe, the Bailey Bridge appeared repeatedly in assessments of American success. The official U.S. Army history of the Corps of Engineers noted that over 3,000 Bailey Bridges were constructed in the European theater between D-Day and VE Day, with a combined length of over 90 miles. These bridges carried millions of men and vehicles, millions of tons of supplies, enabling the rapid advance that collapsed German resistance in less than a year. The cost in engineer casualties was significant, over 2,000 killed and 8,000 wounded, but the contribution to victory was incalculable. Without these bridges, the American advance would have been measured in months rather than weeks, giving Germany time to consolidate defenses, time to deploy the V-2 rockets and jet aircraft that might have changed the war's dynamics, time for the Nazi regime to develop atomic weapons or negotiate a separate peace. The bridges, and the men who built them, shortened the war and saved countless lives. The symbolic resonance of the portable bridge extended beyond the war itself. In the post-war period, as Europe was rebuilt under the Marshall Plan, American engineering and industrial capacity again transformed the landscape. Bridges, roads, factories, power plants, all the infrastructure of modern civilization was reconstructed with American assistance. The Bailey Bridges of the war became permanent structures in many locations, concrete monuments to temporary expediency. German civilians who had watched these bridges appear under fire now used them daily, physical reminders of the power that had defeated their nation and then helped rebuild it. The bridge became a symbol of American pragmatism, the willingness to solve problems through engineering rather than ideology, to build rather than destroy when destruction was no longer necessary. German veterans, in their post-war memoirs and interviews, often returned to the image of those bridges. They represented something that could not be explained away by propaganda about racial superiority or fighting spirit. They were evidence, physical and undeniable, that the United States possessed capabilities the Reich could never match. This recognition contributed to the thoroughness of German denazification, the acceptance that the old ideology had led only to catastrophe, that the American model of industrial democracy represented a superior system. The bridges built under fire became, in memory, the bridges that connected Germany's past to its future, that demonstrated the possibility of a different kind of power, one based on production rather than destruction. Lieutenant Colonel Peregrine, the engineer commander at Remagen, would later reflect on his wartime experience in a memoir published in the 1980s. He wrote, "We were not heroes in the traditional sense. We did not charge machine gun nests or hold impossible positions. We built bridges. But in building those bridges, we demonstrated what America was about. We showed that free men, properly trained and equipped, could accomplish impossible things. We proved that democracy was not weakness, but strength, that our system could mobilize resources and direct them with precision, that totalitarianism could only envy. Every bridge we built was a vote of confidence in the American way, a statement that we could engineer solutions to any problem. The Germans could not understand this. They thought in terms of will and sacrifice. We thought in terms of planning and production. Our way won." This philosophical difference, this fundamental divergence in how societies organize and motivate themselves, was what the portable bridge ultimately represented. It was not just a tool, but a worldview made manifest. The American approach to warfare was an extension of the American approach to everything. Identify the problem, engineer a solution, mass-produce the solution, deploy it systematically. There was no mysticism in this, no appeal to blood and soil or thousand-year destinies, just practical problem-solving backed by industrial capacity. And it worked. It worked so well that within a generation, Germany itself had adopted much of this approach, becoming an industrial powerhouse in its own right, building its prosperity on American models of efficiency and standardization. The bridge also symbolized democratic values in a way that weapons could not. Tanks and bombs are instruments of destruction, necessary evils in warfare. But bridges are constructive. They connect. They enable movement and communication. They serve life rather than death. That American engineers focused so much effort on bridges, that they died building them, that they treated bridge construction as essential to victory. This said something about the kind of society they represented. America fought not to conquer, but to liberate. Not to destroy, but to restore. not to dominate, but to democratize. The bridges built under fire were preludes to the infrastructure of peace, evidence that the American vision extended beyond mere victory to the reconstruction that would follow. As the war ended and occupation began, many of those Bailey bridges remained in place, serving civilian populations whose own infrastructure had been demolished by years of conflict. German civilians, emerging from rubble and ruin, used American-built bridges to begin the process of recovery. They drove across them in trucks, carrying food and medicine. They walked across them to visit displaced family members. They rebuilt their lives on literal American foundations, and the symbolism was not lost on anyone. The occupiers had become rebuilders, the destroyers had become constructors, and the bridges stood as testimony to this transformation. Decades after the war, German historians studying the period would identify the portable bridge as a key factor in their nation's rapid defeat. Dr. Klaus Müller, a military historian at the University of Heidelberg, wrote in a 1975 study, "The Bailey Bridge represented the culmination of Allied material superiority. It was not the decisive weapon in any single battle, but its cumulative effect was devastating to German defensive strategy. Every river line we hoped to hold was breached within days. Every demolition we executed was bypassed within hours. We destroyed the infrastructure of our own country, and it made no difference because the Americans simply built new infrastructure as they advanced. This taught us that modern war cannot be won by any nation that lacks industrial depth. It taught us that courage and sacrifice, while admirable, cannot overcome systematic material disadvantage. It was a hard lesson, but a necessary one. The men who built those bridges, the American engineers who worked under fire, most returned home after the war to civilian lives. They became contractors and civil engineers, teachers and businessmen. Many never spoke much about their service, considering what they had done to be simply their duty. But they carried with them the knowledge that they had participated in something extraordinary, that their technical work had strategic importance, that they had helped win a war, not with bullets, but with rivets and steel panels and careful planning. They had proven that in modern warfare, the builders could be as important as the fighters, that logistics could triumph over tactics, that systematic competence could defeat ideological fervor. The portable bridge under fire remains one of the most striking images of the Second World War's final phase. It captures everything about the conflict's nature, the industrial scale, the material disparity, the contrast between American abundance and German scarcity, the triumph of practical engineering over ideological passion. For German soldiers watching these structures rise, it was a moment of profound disillusionment, the shattering of beliefs about Teutonic superiority and racial destiny. For American soldiers building them, it was confirmation that their system worked, that their way of war was effective, that the values they fought for were embodied in the very tools they used. And so, we return to that moment on the Rhine, to German soldiers in their positions watching steel rise from nothing, watching bridges grow under fire, watching the impossible become routine. They are witnessing the death of their cause in real time, watching belief collapse under the weight of material reality. The bridge extends, section by section, each piece fitting perfectly, because all pieces were designed to fit, because American factories produced them to exact specifications, because the system worked. German soldiers fire their weapons and sometimes hit their targets, and always the bridge continues to grow because there are always more sections, more engineers, more everything. They are fighting abundance with scarcity, system with desperation, and the outcome was never in doubt. The bridge completes. Tanks begin to cross. Infantry follows. The bridgehead expands. Germany contracts. The war moves toward its inevitable conclusion. And in the memories of the men who witnessed it, German and American alike, that image remains. The portable bridge under fire, growing despite all opposition, connecting west to east, present to future, defeat to reconstruction. It was not the largest bridge or the most important, tactically, but it was perfect symbol of what the war had become. What it had always been beneath the rhetoric and ideology, a contest between systems, between ways of organizing society and mobilizing resources, between visions of what humanity could achieve. The bridge said, "We can build faster than you can destroy. We can connect faster than you can divide. We can create faster than you can tear down." And in saying this, it spoke a truth that no amount of propaganda could refute, that no appeal to blood and soil could overcome. The future belongs to builders, and America was building even in the midst of war, even under fire, even when every rational calculation said it was impossible. That was the lesson of the portable bridge. That was why German soldiers stood frozen, watching, beginning to understand. That was the moment ideology met reality, and reality won.